Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare. Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare. Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare. Chapter 6. Rishiruvacha iti tasam swashaktinam satinam asametya saha prasuptalokatantranam nishamya gatimishvaraha. The Rishi Maitreyi said, "The Lord thus heard about the suspension of the progressive creative functions of the universe due to the non-combination of his potencies such as Mahat Tattva. Kala sangyam tada devim bibrachakti murukramaha त्रयोविंशति तत्त्वानां गणं युगपदाविशत्. The Supreme Powerful Lord then simultaneously entered into the 23 elements with the goddess Kali, his external energy, who alone amalgamates all the different elements. Sonu pravishto bhagavanscheshtarupena tam ganam bhinnam samyojayamasa suktam karma prabodhayan. Thus, when the personality of Godhead entered into the elements by his energy, all the living entities were enlivened into different activities, just as one is engaged in his work after awakening from sleep. Prabhuddha karma daivena trayorvimshatiko ganaha prerito janayat swabhir matrabhiradhi purusham. When the 23 principal elements were set in action by the will of the Supreme, the gigantic universal form or the Vishwarupa body of the Lord came into existence. Parena vishata swasmin matraya vishwabhruganaha Vishwasrugganaha chukshobhanyonyamasadya yasmin lokascharacharaha. As the Lord, in his planetary portion, entered into elements of the universal creation, they transformed into the gigantic form in which all the planetary systems and all the movable and immovable creations rest. Hiranmayassa Purushaha Sahasraparivatsaran Andakosha Uvasapsu Sarvasattvopabhrumhitaha. The gigantic Virat Purusha, known as Hiranmaya, lived for 1,000 celestial years on the water of the universe, and all the living entities lay with him. Savai Vishwasrujam Garbho Devakarmatma Shaktiman Vibhabhajatmanatmanam Ekadadasha Tridha. The total energy of the Mahat Tattva in the form of the gigantic Virat Rupa divided himself by himself into consequences of the living entities, the life of activity and self-identification, which are subdivided into 1, 10 and 3 respectively. Yesha येष ह्यशेषसत्त्वानाम् आत्मांशः परमात्मनः आद्योऽवतारो यत्रासौ भूतग्रामो विभाव्यते. The gigantic universal form of the Supreme Lord is the first incarnation and the planetary portion of the Supersoul. He is the self of an unlimited number of living entities, and in him rests the aggregate creation which thus flourishes. Sadhyatma Sadidaivascha Sadibhuta iti tridha Virat prano dashavida ekada hrudayena cha. The gigantic universal form is represented by 3, 10, and 1 in the sense that he is the body and the mind and the senses. He is the dynamic force for all movements by 10 kinds of life energy, and he is the one heart where life energy is generated. Smaran Vishwa Srujamisho Vignapitamadhokshajaha Virajamatapatsvena Tejasaisham Vivruttaye. The Supreme Lord is the supersoul of all the demigods, entrusted with the task of concentrating the cosmic manifestation. Being thus prayed to by the demigods, he thought to himself and thus manifested the gigantic form for their understanding. Atatasya katidhayatananiha nirabhidyanta devanam tani me ghadatashrunu. Maitreya said, "You may now hear from me how the Supreme Lord separated himself into the diverse forms of the demigods after the manifestation of the gigantic universal form. Tasyagnirasyam nirbhinnam lokapalo vishatpadam vacha swamshena vaktavyam yayasau pratipadhyate." Agni or heat separated from his mouth, and all the directors of material affairs entered into it in their respective positions. By that energy, the living entity expresses himself in words. Nirbhinnam talu varuno lokapalo vishadharehe jihvayam shena cha rasam yayasau pratipadhyate. When the palette of gigantic form was separately manifested, Varuna, the director of air in the planetary systems, entered therein, and thus the living entity has the facility to taste everything with his tongue. Nirbhinne ashvinau nase Vishnora-vishatam padam Ghranenamshyena gandhasya pratipattiryato bhavet. When the Lord's two nostrils separately manifested themselves, the dual Ashwini Kumaras entered them in their proper positions, and because of this, the living entities can smell the aromas of everything. Nirbhinne akshini tvashta lokapalo vishadvibhoho chakshushamshena rupanam pratipattiryato bhavet. Thereafter, the two eyes of the gigantic form of the Lord were separately manifested. The sun, the director of light, entered them with a partial representation of eyesight, and thus the living entities can have vision of forms. निर्भिन्नान् यस्य चर्माणि लोकपालो निलोविशत् प्राणेनांश्येन संस्पर्शं येनासौ प्रतिपद्यते. When there was a manifestation of the skin separated from the gigantic form, Anila, the deity directing the wind, entered with partial touch, and thus the living entities can realize tactile knowledge. Karnavasya vinirbinnau dishnyam swam vividhurdishah श्रोत्रेणांशेन शब्दस्य सिद्धिं येन प्रपद्यते. When the ears of the gigantic form became manifested, all the controlling deities of the directions entered into them with the hearing principles by which all the living entities hear and take advantage of sound. त्वचमस्य विनिर्भिन्नाम् विविशुर्धिष्ण्यमोषधीः अंशेन रोमभिः कण्डूम् यैरसौ प्रतिपद्यते. When there was a separate manifestation of skin, the controlling deities of sensations and their different parts entered into it, and thus the living entities feel itching and happiness due to touch. मेड्रं तस्य विनिर्भिन्नं स्वधिष्ण्यं क उपाविशत् रेतसांशेन येनासावान् आनन्दं प्रतिपद्यते. When the genitals of the gigantic form separately became manifest, then Prajapati, the original living creature, entered into them with his partial semen, and thus the living entities can enjoy sex pleasure. Gudam pumso vinirbinnam mitro lokesha avishat payunam shyena yenasau visargam pratipadyate. The evacuating channel separately became manifest, and the director named Mitra entered into it with partial organs of evacuation. Thus, the living entities are able to pass stool and urine. Hastavasya vinirbhinna vindra swarpatiravishat vartayamshyena purusho yaya vrittim prapadyate. Thereafter, when the hands of the gigantic form separately became manifested, Indra, the ruler of the heavenly planets, entered into them, and thus the living entity is able to transact business for his livelihood. Padavasya vinirbhinnau lokesho vishnuravishat gatya swamshyena purusho yaya prapyam prapadyate. Thereafter, the legs of the gigantic form separately became manifest, and the demigod named Vishnu, not the personality of Godhead, entered with partial movement. This helps the living entity move to his destination. Buddhim chasya vinirbhinnam Vagisho dishnyamavishat bodhenam shyena bodhavyam pratipattiryato bhavet. When the intelligence of the gigantic form separately became manifest, Brahma, the Lord of the Vedas, entered into it with the partial power of understanding, and thus an object of understanding is experienced by the living entities. Hrudayam chasya nirbhinnam chandramadishnyamavishat manasam shena yenasau vikriyam pratipadyate. After that, the heart of the gigantic form separately manifested itself, and into it entered the moon, demigod, with partial mental activity. Thus, the living entity can conduct his mental speculations. Atmanam chasya nirbhinnam abhimano vishatpadam karmanam shyena yenasau kartavyam pratipadhyate. Thereafter, the materialistic ego of the gigantic form separately manifested itself, and into it entered Rudra, the controller of false ego, with his own partial activities, by which the living entity transacts his objective actions. Sattvam chasya vinirbinnam mahandishnyamupavishata चित्तेनांश्येन येनासौ vijnanam pratipadhyate. Thereafter, when his consciousness separately manifested itself, the total energy, Mahat Tattva, entered with his conscious part. Thus, the living entity is able to conceive specific knowledge. शीर्ष्णोऽस्य दौर्धरा पद्भ्यां स्वं नाभेरुपपद्यत गुणानां वृत्तयो येषु प्रतीयन्ते सुराधयः. Thereafter, from the head of the gigantic form, the heavenly planets were manifested, and from his legs, the earthly planets, and from his abdomen, the sky separately manifested themselves. Within them, the demigods and others also were manifested in terms of modes of material nature. Atyantikena satvena dhivam devah prapedhire dharam rajasvabhavena panayo ye chatananu. The demigods, qualified by the super excellent quality of the mode of goodness, are situated in the heavenly planets, whereas the human beings, because of their nature in the mode of passion, live on the earth in company with their subordinates. Tartiyena svabhavena bhagavanabhimashritah ubhayorantaram vyoma ye rudra parshadam ganaha. Living entities who are associates of Rudra develop in the third mode of material nature or ignorance. They are situated in the sky between the earthly planets and the heavenly planets. Mukato vartata brahma purushasya kurudvaha yastun mukatvadvarnanam mukyayorbhuhva mukkyayorbhubrahmano guruhu mukkayobhud brahmano guruhu. Mukkyayorbhud brahmano guruhu. Okay. O chief of the Kuru dynasty, the Vedic wisdom became manifested from the mouth of the Virat, the gigantic form. Those who are inclined to this Vedic knowledge are called Brahmanas, and they are the natural teachers and spiritual masters of the orders of society. Bahubhyo vartata kshatram kshatriyastadanuvrataha yojatasrayate varnan paurushah kantakakshatat. Thereafter, the power of protection was generated from the arms of the gigantic Virat form, and in relation to such power, the Kshatriyas also came into existence by following the Kshatriya principle of protecting society from the disturbances of thieves and miscreants. Vishorvartanta tasyorvor lokavruttikarir vibhoho vaishyastad तदुद्भवो वार्तां नृणां यः समवर्तयत्. The means of livelihood of all persons, namely production of grains and their distribution to the prajas, was generated from the thighs of the Lord's gigantic form. The mercantile men who take charge of such execution are called Vaishyas. Padbhyam Bhagavato Jajne Susrusha Dharma Siddhaye Tasyam Jatah Pura Shudro Yadvrut Tushyate Harihi. Thereafter, service was manifested from the legs of the personality of Godhead for the sake of perfecting the religious function. Situated on the legs are the Sudras, who satisfy the Lord by service. Yete varna swadharmena yajanti swagurum harim Shraddayatmavishuddhyartam yajyata sahavrittibihi. All these different social divisions are born with their occupational duties and living conditions from the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Thus, for unconditional love and self realization, one has to worship the Supreme Lord under the direction of the spiritual master. एतत् क्षतर्भगवतो दैवकर्मात्मरूपिणः कश्रद्धद्यादुपाकुर्कर्तुं योगमायाबलोधयम्. O Vidura, who can estimate or measure the transcendental time, work, and potency of the gigantic form manifested by the internal potency of the Supreme Personality of Godhead? Tatapi kirtayam yangam yathamati yatashrutam kirtim hare swam satkartum Giramanyabhidhasatim. In spite of my inability, whatever I have been able to hear from the spiritual master and whatever I could assimilate, I am now describing in glorification of the Lord by pure speech, for otherwise my power of speaking would remain unchaste. एकान्तलाभं वचसोऽनुपुंसां सुश्लोकमौलेर्गुणवादमाहुः श्रुतेश्च विश्वद्भिरुपाकृतायां कथासुधायामुपसंप्रयोगम्. The highest personal gain of humanity is to engage in discussions of activities and glories of the pious actor. Such activities are so nicely arranged in writing by the greatly learned sages that the actual purpose of the year is served just by being near them. Atmano vasito vatsa mahima kavinadhina samvatsara sahasrante Dhiya yoga vipakkaya. O my son, the original poet, Brahma, after mature meditation for 1000 celestial years, could know only that the glories of the Supreme Soul are inconceivable. Ato bhagavato maya Mayinamapi mohini yatsvam chatmavat yatsvam chatmavat yatsvam chatma वर्त्मात्मा okay. यस्त्वं चात्वमर्त्वात्मा न वेद किमुत्तापरे यस्त्वं चात्मवर्त्मात्मा न वेद उतापरे न वेद उतापरे. The wonderful potency of the Supreme Personality of Godhead is bewildering even to the jugglers. That potential power is unknown even to the self sufficient Lord, so it is certainly unknown to others. Yato prapyanyvartanta vachascha manasa saha aham chanya ime devas tasmai bhagavate namaha. Words, mind, and ego, with their respective controlling demigods, have failed to achieve success in knowing the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Therefore, we simply have to offer our respectful obeisances unto Him as a matter of sanity. Thus ends the chapter entitled Creation of the Universal Form. Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare. Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare. Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare.